All right, so we are going to look at our review for the Civil War today and some of the key things. So, first thing we're going to talk about right now are the key battles that you need to know about, or at least the kind of ideas for some of the battles, and then some of the key people. So that's first thing. Then we're going to talk about a few other things. So, beginning of the war, we are talking about the Fort Sumter. That's kind of where the fighting begins. Remember that the Confederates are the ones that fired first. Abraham Lincoln, he brought supplies in there, and the Confederates didn't want that. Fort Sumter is located in South Carolina, but it was a federal base, a federal fort that was being kept by the United States government, and from the Confederates' point of view, in their territory, and so they weren't going to allow that. So that's where the war begins, but the Confederates started. The first major battle where there's significant fighting and large armies is the first Battle of Bull Run. Uh, both sides kind of expected to win really quickly. Ultimately, the Confederacy wins, and it is a victory for them. And a little, both sides though realize this is not just going to be some quick victory either way. Likely, this could be a drawn out war with lots of death. Um, the Battle of Antietam is an important battle. The war in the Eastern campaign, or in the Eastern theater of the war, has been going poorly for the Union, and this is ultimately a victory for the Union. It's a one-day battle. It's the bloodiest single day in the war, and after that one day, uh, the Confederates retreat. So it is a victory for the Union. Now, on the field of battle, it was kind of a draw, but the Confederates realized that it wasn't worth it for them, and so they do retreat, which makes it a Union victory. Although because they didn't pursue that victory and continue to attack, the Union didn't. It wasn't as big a victory as it could have been. Uh, as a result of the victory at Antietam, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation and says, "Hey, look, we are this is," and that changes what the war is about. We'll talk more about the Emancipation Proclamation in a minute, but that is one of the key things about the Battle of Antietam is that it encourages Lincoln to go ahead and issue that Emancipation Proclamation. Then we've got kind of the twin victories in July for the Union, which are Vicksburg and Gettysburg. Vicksburg is a siege where they're surrounding the Union is surrounding the Confederates, and we see that one of the reasons for Vicksburg is this divides the Confederacy in half. It cuts off Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas. It keeps, excuse me, from being able to really get their supplies to the rest of the Confederacy, especially some of the supplies from Texas and Louisiana. And so it divides it. It gives the Union control of the Mississippi River. There's one other battle that has to take place, but this is the last major point that is stopping the Union. And so this is key. The Battle of Gettysburg is a Confederate invasion into Union territory. There weren't a lot of those. Antietam was one, and it was a Union victory. Uh, Gettysburg is kind of the other big one, and this one's huge. This is the biggest battle of the war, the largest two armies really that we see gathered together. Lots and lots of casualties on both sides. The Union is victorious, and Robert E. Lee will never be able to invade the Union again after this. His idea was that he will get in there and kind of break the will of the Union, that they'll give up because there's a lot of people that are upset about this war. It's been going on for years now, and they don't want to keep fighting. And he's not successful. Robert E. Lee's not successful. The Union is successful and wins. And the fighting's not over. The war's going to last for like 21 more months, but it is kind of, we start to see the advantages of the Union pay off here. The other big thing other kind of battles here, is this idea of total war or defensive war, or I'm sorry, destructive war, total war, where the Union is destroying, going into the South or into Georgia from Tennessee, and destroying not just the armies, but the very infrastructure and civilian supplies and things like that that the civilians would live off of in an effort to break the will of the South in fighting this war. It is successful in that it really does decimate and destroy a lot of the infrastructure, important like railroad lines and things like that that the Confederates needed to supply their troops. And so it is a big victory for the Union. They are able to, William T. Sherman's march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah, lots of destruction. They march on up into North Carolina or South Carolina and North Carolina and continue much of those same activities. Ultimately, the the Confederates, Robert E. Lee, surrenders to Ulysses S. Grant in Appomattox Courthouse, which is a town called Appomattox Courthouse. It's not a courthouse in the town of Appomattox. All right, some of the key people. Jefferson Davis is the president of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee is a Confederate general, kind of the highest ranking Confederate general, the most successful. Ulysses S. Grant is Union general. Ultimately, it doesn't start the war off this way, but ultimately becomes the most the senior general in the Union Army. Stonewall Jackson is a general in the Confederate Army. He is killed fairly early on in the war, but he is kind of Robert E. Lee's right-hand man early in the war. William Tecumseh Sherman is kind of Ulysses S. Grant's right-hand man in the war, and he is the one that we just talked about with the March to the Sea and that idea of total war. So what are some other things here? So, we've talked about causes of the war. We talked about slavery being the main cause of the war, that the reason that the Confederacy leaves the Union is to protect slavery. They talk about states' rights, but the right that they were trying to protect there with states' rights is the right to own slaves. And so, ultimately, Abraham Lincoln at first has said that his goal is simply to preserve the Union, is to say that the South can't leave. You don't have the right to separate. It is a perpetual Union. Well, that is his goal and his stated goal for the war. With the Emancipation Proclamation after the Battle of Antietam, it now becomes a goal of also freeing the slaves. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is not terribly successful at freeing a lot of slaves right at first. It doesn't free slaves in the border states, but it does everywhere. But what happens is everywhere the Union Army goes now, the enslaved people are escaping and getting on the other side of the Confederate of the Union Army, and therefore escaping and gaining freedom, and that is hurting the economy of the South as well. So the Union Army really does become an army of liberation. Everywhere they go, slaves are being freed. Ultimately, the Civil War does result in the ending of slavery. Let's see. I'm just trying to look over notes, make sure I don't forget any key things I want you to know. Yes, so one of the things, the Union is the draft riots. Many people in the North were upset about the draft because they end up, you could, if you were wealthy, you could pay $300 to get out of the draft. Well, they could get out of it. They were also upset because some of these people, especially the Irish, they're not really that fond of this idea of freeing the slaves, because these enslaved people are going to move. These formerly enslaved people are going to rush up into these northern cities. They're going to end up taking what the Irish consider their jobs in factories, and they're like, I don't really want to die in a war to free slaves, and then they get freedom, and then they're going to come take my job, is the way it was seen. And so those two things were something that they did not, the people did not support the draft. They didn't want to go fight in this war to do something that they felt like going to help them. Don't forget the advantages that the Union has. They have a larger free population. They had greater manufacturing capability. The South was fighting their advantages. They're fighting a defensive war. They're fighting for their property. And so that, of course, in this case, is talking about the slaves. So understand those things. The Union also has the advantages of more railroads. The Union also, the South, they had more, their generals, especially at first, were kind of an advantage, although Ulysses S. Grant, William Sherman are great, turn out to be great generals as well. The Union also has a navy. That's an advantage. The South has Robert E. Lee, who was a good general. Emancipation Proclamation, we've talked about. It's an order freeing all the slaves in the Confederate States. It doesn't free all slaves, it frees slaves in the Confederate States, in those states that are in rebellion. Um, it changes the war. Remember, it changes the war. It makes the war not just about protecting the Union and preserving the Union, but now it makes it about ending slavery. Um, don't forget, there's going to be questions about the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So make sure you kind of look over those things as well. I think that kind of gives you most of the things that this is about. So study, play the review games, and y'all have a great day.